the subject matter.
My apologies. Keep going, Charles.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, you all. We learn the process. We learn about engineering. We learn structural analysis, structural design, mechanical, electrical, landscape, civil, all the things that go to making a community, making a city what it is that you all live in. All of those subject matters we are taught in our process. And when you finally get out of that process, you have to go before a state board to take a license to become a registered, certified person in your state and or throughout the whole US of A and any other place that you want. But every municipality has their own tests, their own requirements. And unless you pass that in each area or each state, you're only allowed to practice in the state where you get your license. I'm currently licensed in 3 separate states in the US of A. Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin is where primarily I perform my role as an architect. See, I want to stop with that. Hopefully.
Okay, awesome. And just for everyone to know, after we have this initial conversation, we will then open up to a discussion with Charles around. We have some question prompts, but if things are coming up in your mind as we talk, please jot them down and we can bring them to the table as well. Charles, what would you say?
One misconception, though, I do want to admit to everyone. We do not build buildings. People ask me, what architects do? We do not build buildings. That's the role of the general contractor. We oversee, we watch, we observe work that the general contractor would do, but architects do not build buildings unless they're general contractors. I just needed to answer that question. A lot of people ask me, you all build buildings? No, we don't build buildings. That's all. So I have to say.
And just to stretch that out just a hair more, so if architects don't build buildings, architects design and plan and coordinate, I get, the stuff. Do all those plans turn into buildings all the time?
No, sometimes they do, sometimes they do not. There are various reasons why. Sometimes the client that retains us to do that, they do not either get the funding or they lose the interest. So we provide partial services. When the project goes through full architectural service approach, then yes, you will see the schools that you see in the various cities. You'll see the high rises, you'll see the churches, you'll see the shopping malls, you'll see everything you see in America that we all utilize, probably designed by an architect, with all the other people I mentioned being involved, the engineers, the contractors, the civil, electrical, mechanical, etc. people. But everything in America, throughout the world, is in 9 out of 10 cases designed by an architect in that municipality. Yes, Kiela.
Got it. Thank you. So on a kind of slightly bigger picture view, what do you believe is the role of it? What role does an architect play in society in general?
I like to use the comparison when I was in school they would give us. And if you all think of a ship, you go on a cruise ship, etc., and you have the captain of the ship. The captain will always go down with the ship, but the captain does control, manipulate, and give orders to everyone that's running the ship. We see the captain, but we don't see him doing anything. You see the architect, but all of those entities that I spoke about are the ones that put the total project together. The architect, with artists or anyone else, we come up with concepts, we talk about pre-design ideas. We try to establish with the client what the fees may be, what the construction costs, probable construction costs may be. And once we have that, and normally we just do that as just to help to visualize what the client, and it's important for us to remember the client is the one that brings the idea to the architect, unless the architect is the client. But in most cases, my job is to work with the client's wishes, aspirations, concerns, to give them the vision that they seek, not to give them the vision that I see. My job is to give them the vision that they see in a creative, forward-thinking, progressive way. I'm through with that.
So that's great. That actually leads to the next thing that we had planned to discuss, which is kind of that space of pre-design. And for that, I'm going to just show a slide real quick on the screen for everyone. And Charles, you can speak to it. There we go. So you talked about pre-design, and here you said that phase of planning that an architect does with the client should include community meetings or meetings with community, with stakeholders, which of course includes the client or clients, design charrettes, and that the architect is paid based on an hourly fee at this point, correct?
That is correct.
Can you just, for clarity, because everyone on here, I'm not going to assume everyone knows, can you just explain what a design charrette is?
Design charrette is a place where the community, the architects, any other associated people with the architects meet in whatever space that you can arrange, and we all sit around and we go through a thought process. Everyone in that room for that charrette becomes a designer, and they share in whatever the central idea is that we're discussing. And everyone, through either cards or sharing notes, a lot of times you just allow people to put down what they think the subject matter represents or what it is they think they're being asked. And then we put all of those ideas. If you have 10 people in the room, you have 100 people in the room. You pin them up, and we all go through looking at those ideas to try to come up with something, some direction of what it is that we're coming together for. So if the artists are talking, and you have different types of artists in all kinds of categories, or you have people in the community who don't understand what it is that they're even there for. But at the end of the process of that design charrette, which normally can take 3 to 4 hours, depending on the time limitations, then we all discuss what is put up on the board and try to pick out those elements that we feel are important based upon the subject matter that we're discussing. Hopefully it's just a coming together, a feeling good moment when you're in a room and you are that person called the designer or the architect.
Or even if you're not for the moment, for those few hours, you enter a design process and have that experience, correct?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, you in us preparing for this, you gave an example about once a guesstimate of the total project and construction cost is determined, that's how then the additional architectural fees are calculated. So that pre-design process engages the minds of those who, if I'm grasping what you're saying, engages the minds of all those people in a charrette and in other ways.
Because at the end of the day, no matter what you do, everyone is concerned about one thing. What is it going to cost me?
Okay.
How much is this project?
So does that happen before or after this pre-design process?
That process happens after the client, whoever it is, working with the architect, because those are the people that the architect fees are determined by, or are given to, not to the charrette team, because the charrette team could be a multiple discipline of people, community, children, adults, us older folk, people who are under 20 years of age, like myself, and other people who just have, they're not concerned about the cost, but the owner or the person who really wants this to happen is definitely concerned about the cost. So in that process, we kind of guesstimate, and I'll use the word guesstimate, what that cost might be. And based upon that guesstimate, then we can start talking about what are the real fees that I would be subjected to, that is the client speaking to me, that I might be subjected to.
Okay.
And so that's how we get to some idea. I'd say it's something that, let's say it costs $1 million. Now, what does that mean from the standpoint of the architect? Well, you have to pay him because that
Or
million.
her, or her,
I'm sorry, what's that?
or her.
Or her, I'm sorry, yes. That $1 million is what the total construction cost, whatever it is that we're trying to create, not the architect's fee, the total construction cost of what that might be. And based upon that, as you see on the screen, if you're looking at new construction, let's say, it could be anywhere between 6 to 8% of that total construction cost. It could be. The other one is if you're doing a renovation, you may have a building that just needs to be totally renovated, the mechanical, the electrical, et cetera, rather than building something new, could be anywhere from 10 to 13% of what the renovation cost might be. And the reason for that fee being higher, because when you run into unforeseen conditions, you're not sure what you might run into, like the electrical, mechanical, the roof, the structures, and the outside might have to be redone. But when you're doing new construction, you totally control everything that's in the building. So there's a little more involvement in the renovation. So that's why we talk 10 to 13%. Those numbers you see on your chart with dollars, that is just a way of saying what it might be, but that number would change based upon new construction or renovation.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Awesome. Thank you for that clarity, Charles. And I'm gonna pop the next slide in and then we'll go back so everyone can see each other, because Charles also shared some information that I thought would be good just for people to understand. So once you go through this step of pre-design, getting a guesstimate to the client of the cost so they can see what that total cost would be for the architectural process, then this $60,000 to $80,000 estimate, or this $100,000 to $130,000 estimate, whether it's new construction or renovation, would then break down and be paid out to the architect over the course of different phases. Is that right?
It would be paid out if all the 5 phases that are listed are completed. It would be paid out over the life of the project. If the project is a year, 6 months, whatever, those phases would occur, and those percentages of that fee that I spoke to earlier would be allocated. As you see for the schematic design, you'll be looking at 15% of the architecture fee, and let's say it took 2 months. So it's that percentage that the architect would be looking for to receive. And then you have design, development, construction documents, bidding, and construction observation. But it's important to mention that if for some reason in any one of those phases, you need the mechanical, the structural, the electrical engineers and all of those people, or civil or landscapers, those people get paid out of that percentage that the architect is receiving. So you as a client would not be paying those people that I would use. They would be my consultants, and they all will receive their pay through those phases, those 5 phases I showed. So that you're not paying another fee or thinking anything about that. You're paying the architect one fee, and he pays all the other people that are part of his team. And just, it's not listed here, but another way is thinking of the general contractor, who hires all the subcontractors on a project that you may retain him for or her for. They pay all those fees to those particular people that are involved in constructing whatever the idea that we collectively came up with. So technically the architect fees, a lot of people think, is that what you all get? I say yes, plus all the people we have to retain to make the project real. That is in the design phase, not in the construction phase.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, someone was having trouble getting on the Zoom. I was trying to send them the info. So in the end, the client pays in some sort of way the full $1 million, but the architect's fees is just that portion of it.
That
correct?
Is correct. That is correct.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And that's just to give people like, oops, I'm not on video. And I was raised around this stuff, and it took me a long time for it to just really gel in my mind. Like, what does this really mean, and how does this play out? So I think this is a good foundation for people to now understand. So you go from this idea, then the architect helps, but what, I mean, why can't, like, so if artists want to develop some space for themselves, or get a building, or are gifted something, or want to develop something, why can't they just do it themselves?
Okay. It's really, I won't say it's simplistic, but construction, the built environment in any township, city, et cetera, is controlled by your elected municipalities and the rules and regulations of that municipality where you're trying to build something. The architect and the structural engineer in America are the only two people who can pull building permits for any project that's going on that is architecture related. Only those two individuals in the total process have to pull permits. Contractors go pick up permits, but they cannot get permits just being a general contractor. They must go through the licensed professional. And those two people are the architect, the registered architect, and the structural engineer. That's a simple fact. It's based upon laws, legalities, zoning regulations, accessibility requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And the architect is the sole person who's responsible for making sure any built projects follow those rules and regulations.
So, like, I know, I just want to throw an idea out. I know a guy who squatted in a building, and he'd like lived in this building with no heat, and he did this. I mean, it's a bit extreme. It's not like the norm. He was an artist, and he ultimately, years later, went through some sort of court process and got the building. And I mean, so he would still then have to come to an architect to do anything with that building legally, I should say. Is that correct?
You said he did not have to?
No, I'm asking, would he? Like,
if the city mandated that he get a permit for being in that building, he had to find a registered architect who would stamp the drawing and make sure that it's compliance with the regulations and of the municipality, the zoning, whatever status the city requires. He would have to seek an architect, a registered architect, not someone out of school, not someone who graduated from an architecture school, but a registered architect who passed the state regulations and the state board requirements.
okay.
You
So,
can squatter in buildings, but that does not mean you own them or you know, or you comply.
mhm.
It just means you're in there.
Okay. So I see some questions coming up in the chat, and I just had kind of one more question to ask, and then we'll segue into the discussion, because the other questions really relate to the discussion. I'm so happy to see these questions coming in. I was just curious, Charles, what, how in your experience does or can the design of a built development help communities? And there's kind of a secondary part of that question. So how can it help communities in general? And then also, how can that, well, go ahead and answer that one. Let me hold the second thought.
Can you repeat the question for us?
So how does the design of a development, right? So like artists, I'm a visual artist. I can design certain things. I grew up around you. I think I might know some, but I really don't, about how to make that happen. And then there are creatives out here who have great ideas. But tell us a little more about how the design of a development can help a community.
Okay. First of all, you really believe that in order to start helping a community, you all have conversations with the community about what their needs are, what the community surroundings are, what it is the community hopes to see. And that's where the word charrettes come into place. That's when you invite the community to sit down with the professionals so as to come up with some idea of what it is you're trying to create And then the other subjects of livability, clean water, good energy, clean air, greening of the community starts to be discussed. And it's through those things that the architect facilitates and the community and the architectural associates, meaning the mechanical engineer, the mechanical engineer, the electrical engineer, the plumbing engineer, the civil engineer, the landscaping people. That's when they all get involved. There's a network of all of those people that make up the architectural services. The architect does not do all of those things by himself or his office. It is in collaboration with other disciplines that something of that nature occurs. So if somebody tells you the architect did everything, I'll say send him back to wherever he came from, because that's where he needs to go.
Okay. Okay. Well, I know I had another question, but in the interest of time, and there's a person who has to jump off who had a question, and I just wanted to address it before, hopefully she's still here. Abba Cherie asked, will let me see, will there be information on how to fund projects like these kinds of ideas we're talking about? And we're not talking about any specific project, we're talking more about kind of that architectural process and how that can assist or relate to developing art space. So Cherie, unfortunately, that's not the focus of this, is not funding, but perhaps that can give us an idea. And we have a post. If you're not muted, could you mute yourself? Perhaps that can help us have an additional conversation in the future soon with perhaps some community, some CDFIs and other funders to give you greater insight to that in early 2022. So when you do the post-event survey, please note that in the comments when you fill that out. I see another.
I would say in all the lending institutions that play a role in making things happen, banks, insurance companies, all the lending institutions play a vital role in getting the monies needed to create the projects that you see.
Will they allow, like if work needs to be done in a building, will they lend to a person who does not involve an architect, or what has been your?
They lend. The people who seek funding are not necessarily architects. They could be anyone seeking funding for a project that they feel is worthy. They go to the bank, they go to the government programs, et cetera, not only to get the monies for the building, they also seek the money to pay the architects and all the other, and the general contractors and all the other people in the process. But banks are required federally to help communities develop, to give monies. The community reinvestment funds, most banks have community entities within their banks. All the major banks have it, and they need to be brought to bear so that they fulfill their obligation. That is a federal law. Most people don't seek it, but it's a federal law.
It is the Community Reinvestment Act. We have another question that says, besides an architect, who else is a member of the development team to make this kind of project happen?
It could be, for instance, it could be all the artists that you all have. It could be people who are interested in knowing how their community is going to be impacted by whatever the ideas are coming up. It could be people just off the street that are interested and they join the organization. It could be us 20-year-old seniors who want to know what's going on. It could be anyone that's interested, as long as there's a responsible entity that's trying to obtain the funds.
I think this question is more specifically about the development team, like the people who are day-to-day, if I'm understanding the question correctly. So that would include someone like yourself, right? But it's not limited to just you.
Yeah, the development team would consist of the owner, normally the architect, the bank, a not-for-profit entity could also become part of that, if that's what you seek, so that from a tax standpoint, you're taking advantage of that opportunity as well. But the development team consists of whatever number of people. Developers have their own internal team, but their team consists of lawyers and other kinds of people that look at the way their land is assessed, how much it might cost to get the property, how much, who's going to purchase the property in the long term, who are going to be those people, what are their financial backgrounds. But the team consists of normally, I'd say, possibly 3 to 5 people or entities, not a lot. But 3 to 5 entities would probably be a team. There's normally what we call, and what developers put out, is a performer. And that performer identifies all the entities that they need necessary to make the project happen. This you'll see in the performer, is what it's called.
So thank you. I have a couple of questions that I think can help foster a conversation between the audience and yourself. But I just wanted to check the chat. So Jalen has a question. How has the industry changed between 20 years ago compared to now? What are some of the more recent issues or complications that this generation of architects have to face?
Oh, okay. Go back to the first question. How has the industry changed? First of all, because of the availability of funds, the availability of money, the interest rates on all the stocks and bonds, as you hear people talk about, they all affect how much money is available to be loaned for a particular project. You also have recently that has affected the economy crazily or very hard is our whole pandemic going on right now with COVID and all the other things that we talk about. Also, we have the issue what we call the haves and the have-nots. And in all these communities, you've got the rich and the poor. The rich people with money have access to all of those options and opportunities that exist. If you're middle class and lower class, you have to prove that you're worthy of receiving money. So you have to mix all of those. Now, that's not an architectural issue, that's a financial issue. And that impacts who gets the money and who does not. What was your second question?
Hold on, the chat went away. The second part of the question is, what are some of the more recent, well, you kind of addressed that, issues or complications that this generation of architects often have to face?
Oh, this generation of architects have to face. Well, because, for instance, I'll give you something that most people probably don't think of. I went to school when all we had was drafting tables, T-squares, and flat rules. Now they have computer programs that generate all kinds of drawings and details necessary so that a contractor can build those things. Even the construction industry have different companies that can generate it. But at the end of the day, regardless of all the technology that we have today, at the end of the day, you must know how to read and interpret all those drawings that you see. Now, when I was going to school, you drew all of those details. You had to actually know how to draw them, what they meant, etc. Nowadays, with all of the programs and technology, most of that stuff is top-up solutions. The question is, can the young architectural entities today understand how to put together details, how to make sure the roof don't leak, how to make sure the building is structurally sound? So the difference, I think, is the technology, which I think is very progressive. I think it's good that we're doing it, but we also have to do our due diligence to make sure that both entities know what they're doing. Entities of the architecture profession and all its associated people, mechanical, electrical, structural, plumbing, engineers, and the construction industry. And making sure all their people also know how to put those pieces together. Right now, I think people would say that the current or the present industry, they do things faster from the standpoint of designing. Construction probably lasts about the same amount of time. You're still going to take, depending on the project, a year to 2 years for that to happen.
Well, we have a question in the chat that's kind of related. It says, where does a civil engineer fit in the building and design of a building?
A civil engineer is a person who works with how the pavement, how the parking lots and all of those things and how you drain them and et cetera, et cetera. That's what a civil engineer would do, more underground work, but the pavement and those kinds of things. Now, so if I speak strictly to civil engineer, it is the site and how the site will work, what is necessary to make the site ready to receive whatever you're trying to put on that site. The building, the parking, etc. And sometimes they can even give you insight into the landscaping aspect, but the landscape architect gets more involved into the details of that. Civil engineer, the sidewalks, the curbs, the parking lots, etc. They do that kind of flat work.
Well, since you brought up landscaping, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and if there's anyone on here who wants to unmute and engage in this conversation and give your opinion as well, that would be awesome. But I'm just curious, how does green space, the landscaping, how does that help foster community interaction in a building that gets built? Like, not just, you could design it, but once it's built, like, how does that green space help foster community interaction?
Well, first of all, green space is talking about the environment. In order for green space to exist, their environment must be receptive to that. For instance, not only the ground, but the air, the water. Even though we're talking green space, we're talking planting. For instance, we now plant on the ground next to the building. We create all of those kinds of things to make the surrounding site look enjoyable, pleasant place you can go to. But we've been also, as the architect engineering industry, we're talking about putting those green spaces on top of the building, putting those green spaces on the side of the building, because you can create green spaces throughout the whole architectural environment and not just adjacent to the property or to the structure that you're trying to create. It could be indoors, it could be outdoors, it could be on top, it could be at the grade level and below grade if one seeks to do that. And the green spaces can be not only in buildings, but playground, you name it, restaurants, etc. Create green space.
So you talked about what's not, like, it doesn't have to be what people traditionally expect, I guess, or have seen. Maybe just, some obligatory bushes in the front, and like it can really have more value for the community or the residents. And that's actually a great segue to this question. And I really would like people to either put in the chat, if you're a creative in particular, or unmute and share your opinion on this. What are some needs, Charles, that you may know as well, that are specific to artists or creatives? So a building, in designing it, like even in the pre-design or the schematic design phase you talked about, what are some needs that artists or creatives may have that wouldn't normally be thought of to design into a traditional building, I guess?
To me, artists give color, give, I call it likeness, give sculptural aspects to their work. But why aren't the buildings that are created done the same way? Why must the building be square, round, rectilinear? It can move all kinds of ways. Why does the building have to be have to be opaque? It can be transparent. There are several projects that you are familiar with where we created all the glass, became the sculptures, became the part of the exterior of the building, but it also served as a sculptural element to the building. Not just put on the building like we do murals and walls. You can also make the building itself, the sculpture, the living sculpture. There were different architects that talked about buildings moving, walking, getting up and moving to another site. Or you can think about the collapsed furniture. Like we talk about people who can't afford, like, well, design furniture that go with you when you leave. Wrap it up, fold it up, and take it with you. Fold up the building. Right now they have buildings talking about 400 square feet living. And the contractors say we can do that. You know, it's 20 by 20 foot site for people who need homes. They unfold on the site and they become apartments for those people, or homes, not just apartments, but homes. And people are talking about that nowadays. And the Veterans Administration is looking into those kinds of ideas for veterans, especially female veterans who may have a hard time finding housing in certain areas. But those are concepts that architects and contractors have started to work on and they're starting to bring about.
So I know we have a few creatives on with us, and I'm not sure if anyone, it's hard for me to toggle through everything. So if anyone who's participating with us is on Facebook and can see any questions in the comments, let me know and feel free to unmute. But I would love to hear from any creatives out there. What kind of things do you find perhaps within or in any way related to the building, either interior or exterior, that are needs that creatives or artists specifically have that maybe a traditional building wouldn't think to design for?
Can I answer that question?
Sure.
Only because I've been talking about this for 30 years. So as a visual artist, some of the basic things that artists need is large windows or quality of light. So they don't need just windows on one side, you know, north light, south light, east, west, whatever they can get, as much as they can get. They need an elevator in order to take work in and out of the building. But as we get older, that's kind of important too. They need large, well, let me put it this way. Some artists, especially with families, like to have absolutely separate space from where they work, from where they live. So they can kind of shut the door and have peace and quiet. But other artists kind of like a wide open space, and they treat it kind of like a theater set. And so they have movable walls, and their kids grow up and go away. And then they don't have to reconstruct or tear down anything. They're kind of using these large closets on wheels to give separation. And when they have projects, theater artists don't often do a lot of work at home, but if you're a playwright and you want to do a play reading, you want to kind of be able to have a nice big space that you give invited audience and other actors sitting on stools, kind of an opportunity to read the play and get some feedback and reaction. But this also leads to another thing where if there's a lot of artists in a building, a community room space, a workroom space is really important. It might not, the artist might not need a huge big space. 1,200 square feet is what I'm thinking of, so it's not gigantic, but they might need it on occasion for rehearsals or to work on a project or any number of reasons, to host an audience. And so in an artist community, it's a little bit more defined than a party room in a condo building, but essentially it's the same thing. It's kind of project oriented. So it's not full of furniture. It's open space that's available for an artist to kind of bring their community together or their project and work on. what we did in our space was we had two shared spaces. One was kind of the living room, the front room. It had a kitchen with running water and a dishwasher and a stove and a refrigerator, so you could have that party all in one room, and host an exhibit. And so it was a nice, clean, gallery-like space. We have another space that's a workroom that's more like a garage space. We don't heat it all the time because it's not used all the time, but it's perfect for storage and for projects. So that's kind of like the dirty space, so to speak. So in an artist community, when you've got 20 to 25 artists and their families living in one space, this community, this shared space is somewhat important.
Thank you. If there's anyone else, either raise your hand or unmute. I wanted to just tie that back to what you were sharing earlier, Charles. And thank you for that, Laura. Is the kinds of things, is there anyone else who had any thoughts, additional thoughts? Because we're talking about all the arts. I mean, you know, perhaps you're a dancer, perhaps there's other needs.
Yeah,
Someone? Go ahead.
I was trying to unmute. So moving into this project here in Bronzeville, I remember telling Laura when I was out of town, I was in I was in Maryland or somewhere when they were showing this space. And all I said to her is, Laura, I just need something that has constant light, daylight, all daylight, a corner unit. You know, I don't have to see it. Just look for me something that fits where I have enough light and not dark spaces, you know, in the place. And so I'm really comfortable with my loft, and it's a live workspace. But there's other things that when this was built, they didn't take into account. Well, there's two like utility sinks. So as artists that we're painting, where does that paint go, right? You know, you have to have a pour off for our paint, and we don't have ventilation in these spaces, you know. So what are they really for? It says live, work, right? But it doesn't really take into account the needs of visual artists, people that are doing sculpture, people that are doing, you know, that kind of work, you know. So I would say that, and even though there's community sinks, the janitor has the closets locked. So how do you pour off this water that will eventually clog the drains? And you know, if you're a paper maker, you can't pour off that paper into regular sink because it'll clog. It'll create a huge clog, you know, of paper. And that happened with me at another artist space that was built by Art Space USA on the west side with the switching station artist loft. Same thing. It was a family-friendly building, but the way there was no amenities, you know, in that space. It was just strictly built in more of a residential space. So they didn't anticipate having a performance space, even though there was a raw like basement, you know what I mean, that wasn't finished. And it was just left there for artists to figure out what to do with. You know, here, you know, in terms of commercial spaces, there's two, you know, gorgeous, you know, commercial spaces that we can lend ourselves to walk out of and create a space for community and communion. But I would say that the incubator was a space that was intended for all of the artists to be able to do something. And then it became a thing where we don't have that space anymore. You know,
Well, Laura,
Well, I was just going to say, Alpha, that thank you for sharing that. And what my heart is most interested in that wouldn't be a factor in the same way as some of what you were talking about our challenges is that artists have ownership of the space. And so that artists can collectively make those decisions about how to use that space, and they're not beholden to some outer entity making the decision for them or for, you know, the group as a whole. And that leads me back, Charles, to you, and then I'll shut up so you can say your piece. Would you say, if I'm understanding right, this whole pre-design phase that the stakeholders and the community and others do with the architect, helps kind of define, getting clear on what these needs are?
To me, that's the most critical phase of the whole process, is the charretting, the talking, the discussion, the needs, talking about what your needs are, et cetera, before you start designing. The design should reflect whoever's developing this, the design should reflect all of those ideas that are mentioned. Now, sometimes cost prohibits things, et cetera, or the budget that people establish, but whatever you do should reflect what is being discussed in the charrettes, in the community meetings, et cetera, et cetera. And some of those concerns that Laura and Alpha mentioned could possibly be resolved before the building is built. You know exactly what you're gonna have. You're gonna know the flexibility of the spaces. I hear people say they want light. I think that's fantastic. Who told anyone that you can't have a glass roof? So the light is in the building, and you have an atrium inside the building, so the light filters all the way down, no matter how many floors you have. You know, they do it in the high rises all the time, but people don't do it in their homes. And you say, well, it's too much light. Then put some shades or blinds over to block it out when you don't need it. When you need it, open it up so that the light permeates the whole structure, the walls, the roof. I mean, I know we say roof. Who says they cannot be? You go to the old Willis Tower, they got floors that you step out on, and they're all glass. And you see down 110 floors, but it's all glass. So what I'm saying is, we use the word sometimes thinking outside the box. You got to think outside the box in the preliminary schematic concepts. And then when you do that, then you bring in the economics and decide what you can afford and not afford to do. But if you don't think about it, if you don't pull those charrette ideas, et cetera, together before you create the structure, you might solve a lot of the concerns that people are expressing. But when a lot of people do not do that, they say, I want a house, and I want 3 bedrooms, and I want 8 baths. And that's what they get. But then the living room is a 10 by 10 foot space. The kitchen is a 6 by 6 foot space. It doesn't work. You know, but some people say, well, it's nice. I just want a house. But before you get a house, before you get an artist studio, before you get lofts for living, before you get nursing homes, before you get hospitals, all those things should go through that vetting process so that the designers, all the team, know exactly what the client is seeking. But then there's one other thing that's very important. The client has to be honest with what their budget is, what their cost allocations will be. So that dreams are one thing, reality in our society means dollars. And I hate to say it that way, but that's what it's about. You can be as creative as the client allows you to be creative. And the client, or whoever that client is, controls the purse strings as well as what they want to see, regardless of the creative people on the team and how imaginative they are. The client controls all of that. So if you all are the client and you want certain things, you make sure whoever that artist, that architect, those contractors, they give you what you want, not a substitute. And it's very important. If you look at a lot of projects that are built, and then someone says, well, we had to cut out plumbing on this floor or that floor because of the budget. Or we didn't give you an elevator. But the accessibility standards that we have now talk about how people who have accessibility have, you know, real issues. Those projects must be resolved or you won't get the funds. You cannot circumvent those things which have been done in the past. You have to follow those regulations. And that's the responsibility they put on your professionals that you hire, the architect in particular, and the people who stamp all of the drawings must comply with ADA and all the other regulations that are out here, hopefully to protect the people. See.
So that pre-design or preliminary process is key. And what I have found, and perhaps Laura, that's why you unmuted, is that with the funding, it's often challenging to get funding for that phase. they'll fund, you can find funding for construction and pre-development of the construction, but that phase that comes before that, that you're saying is so key, is one of the most challenging phases to get funding for if you're not self-funded, which most creative artist projects are not. Did someone want to say something else? And I saw Jalen had her hand up too. Just chime in, go ahead.
So what I wanted to say was the charrette process is kind of a condensed pre-design where the client gets to talk about all they want in the building, but it's important to have finance, whether it's foundations or state agencies or city agencies, et cetera. So we identify a problem as far as here's our community, our client, this is what they want. Here's the places that we can kind of cut costs, but it's the bare minimum. And then here's what they can afford to pay for, and there's a gap. And we address that as a problem early in the process. So we identify, right, that our client brings benefits to the community. There's spaces for arts organizations, commercial as well as non-for-profits, to offer continuing services to the community, but there's a gap between what they can afford to pay and what it costs to put the project together. So identifying that involves financial consultants, affordable housing, business development, those experts can be key players to see the value and how this dynamic project comes together.
Yes, Laura, I agree with you on that.
So
That's very important.
we have a great question that may kind of jump into that a little bit, but I wanted to just check in. Jalen, I saw your hand was up earlier. Did you still have a question?
Well, hi. It was more so a comment that I wanted to make towards what Laura said earlier about the different types of needs and stuff for a creative space for artists. So I'm mainly like involved with theater, the arts, like fiction writing. I recently graduated from UIC last year, and I minored in theater while I was there. And everything that she mentioned about the need for different sections for different needs is so true, because like I would go to like areas in the UIC theater building, and they would have some backstage setups for people who want to rehearse back there. They would have rooms that were dedicated to people who wanted to get into fashion or costume design or building set pieces and all of that stuff. So I just wanted to mention how important it was to have spaces that were dedicated for different purposes. And as someone who also wants to go into not just acting, but also fiction writing, I feel like a creative space for anyone who wants to go into creative writing of any degree, I feel like it varies depending on what the particular needs of the individual are, because in most cases, I feel like creative writers can write in any space depending on what their personal accommodations are. But I've been thinking about it in comparison to architects, in comparison to set designers, um, artists, painters, and all that type of stuff, where it's important to have the environmental aspects and the space and the storage areas for the art to be placed. Whereas nowadays with writers, we have notebooks, journals, using Word documents and all that stuff, and just taking that to different places wherever you go. So it's just something that I've been thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment, Jalen. I'm going to ask this and take this as our last question for Charles, and then do the post survey, and we'll wrap up because we're almost at the end of our time. So Aaron Boyce is asking, Charles, just in brief, if you can, talk about city code restrictions or city plans that might stop your designs. And then, let's see, is that like, as an architect, your problem to get around, or is that the client's problem?
Okay, first of all, whatever project you're seeking to do, one of the first things you want to find out, what's the zoning requirements for that area where you think you want to do something. Not only the zoning requirements, because the city creates zones and certain buildings, certain types of projects can only be put in those zones. For instance, commercial, residential, et cetera, et cetera. You know, just for, you'll notice in the city that certain buildings are grouped around factories and all that stuff. You can't get residential there. Or you can have residential, but you can only have it above the second floor. Other places say you can't have commercial. Then you have religious zones. You can't have churches in certain areas. That's all created by the city zoning ordinance. So the first thing I would do if I was the architect for anyone, before you would tell me what you want and what sites you think you are looking at, first thing I would do is go to the zoning map for the city of Chicago to see what can be built on that particular parcel that you want to do something on. And if it's not allowed, I would look to see, can we get around it? Can we use other variables to try to create it? And if not, my recommendation would be, let's look at 2 or other sites that have the same square footage or whatever you need, so that we don't run into all the legalities of trying to get building permits. So part of that, that's done during that whole first phase that I mentioned, when you're talking about what you want to do. And I'll give a good example. Kiela asked me a question about a site. And the first thing I said, hold on, do you have time? Pull open, go online and look up zoning. I'm the city of Chicago, and look at that site, and it'll tell you what you can build on that site. Now, some people say, oh, we can get around that. Sometimes you can, but it becomes political. It becomes trying to play the games. But there are sites you can get where you don't have to play the games, and it still will serve your needs. As Jalen was saying about,
Is that what's called a zoning variance?
no, it's called a zoning regulations. Variance is trying to get around the zoning.
That's what I
variance.
mean. Trying to get around, it's called a variance. Alpha
It's
wanted
called-
to, I'll ask it, Alpha, because she looks like she's.
Called zoning analysis.
Well, Alpha wanted to know, is this also applicable to other cities, right?
It's
what you're saying.
applicable to US of A and other countries, not just cities. Yes, it's all over. Everyone
Right.
controls
We
their property.
keep referencing Chicago, but there's other people on our cafe in other cities. So I just want to just kind of make that little point.
US of A throughout, zoning occurs everywhere you go, especially in America and other places, but definitely in America. I mentioned Chicago and other states that I've been to, but all of them have different regulations, and they're not all the same. So you have to be careful. But that's what you use your professionals for, to get those kind of questions answered.
So
Prior-
does that help, Aaron? Yes, okay, great. You're muted, but I see your mouth moving. Okay, thank you. Unless there's something else burning someone's brain that hasn't spoken or put something in the chat. I know Mariana, you've been kind of quiet, and that's fine. Or Ra, or Vienna, or Liza even. Unless somebody wants to unmute and speak right now, I'm going to jump to the survey. So let's give it a few seconds.
I think that just like not in our closing, but in looking at the artist housing that's popping up in Bronzeville, and even at the Cornerstone building, you know, when you're building artist spaces, and again, there's no elevator, no ramp to load up, and so I don't know if their architects or developers are building these so that they don't work out as artist communities, they can convert them into regular housing when they don't have the type of amenities that are needed, and they're talking about live workspace.
I would say, just kind of commenting on that, Alpha, take an elevator. You say, can we have an elevator? I would say elevator costs. So you know, to go from one floor to the other, especially if it's over 14 feet, from one floor to the other, it's gonna cost you anywhere from $17,000 to $25,000 just to put an elevator in the building. And sometimes those kind of costs are prohibited to people. But if you're doing a new design and you make it part of the budget, you can get elevators even more. If the building's higher, and then there are also accessibility issues where sometimes you have to provide that to get up to those floors if you have, wheelchair, handicapped folk who can't access it. And ramps can work, you can ramp them, but sometimes the elevator is a faster notion, faster solution. But it's all coming back to what does it cost to put an elevator in a building when you are strapped for cash, when money is a tight issue. You have to figure out
A
other
lot of
ways.
these developers are using tax increment money or money that's set aside for these zones. And you would think that it would be part of the cost. I've seen 3 of these developments. Well, I live in a building that has an elevator. That was the plus of being here, is that an elevator only takes you, we're only 3 stories, it takes you from the ground level to the 3rd floor. And it was part of this building where they're not forcing us to have to do those stairs. But I've seen some other developments that are coming up in Bronzeville that do not have elevators and they're not accessible. Or
Yes,
the handicap accessibles are just basically on a certain level.
and
Yeah.
that's what they do. They
So
limit where people are
I
located.
think Mariana wanted to say something. Let's give her an opportunity.
No, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I just wanted to let you know, there's this, I know the South Loop, the Alma Interior exhibition is interested in hosting more or presenting also more African-American artists at 36 South Iron Street. And it's in this industrial corridor. So, talking about really wonderful spaces for African-American artists. I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And, and of course, there's so I wanted to just mention that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mariana. So let me wrap us up. I just posted in the chat. I'll do it one more time. Can everyone click or copy and paste the post-event survey? I've been getting some texts and I've been getting private messages in the chat, and we've got someone on Facebook Live, an artist, and he's saying, Charles, feedback that you're very deep, you know your stuff. That's what old school creative minds are made of. Good to listen and learn. Thank you again. So if you all can copy and paste the event survey and take it real quick while I give my thanks simultaneously, then I can pass the baton and let these last few minutes of the Research Station Cafe go back to Alpha and Liza. So as you take the survey, Liza, are you able to post it in the Facebook?
Yes,
or-
I can. I'll do that.
Awesome, thank you. I want to again give thanks for everyone, for all of you all for joining, investing part of your day to listen, to learn, to participate, to ask questions. This is how we advance ownership for ourselves, whether it's physical real estate ownership, whether it's idea ownership, whether it's planning and development, whether it's community development, economic development, or even our own personal homes. We have to understand that, one, sometimes there's more to the picture than we might understand at that moment. And so that's part of the purpose of the 2 surveys. I know it was short and brief. I encourage you, please, if everyone who's on, including anyone in Facebook land, if you can just share when this is over, this with one artist that you know, preferably in the Chicago area, because that's what we're kind of focused on for this particular thing. And I want to thank the City of Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events Individual Artist Project, I think I'm getting it right, grant that helped with this. And so we are endeavoring also to get feedback specifically from Chicago artists, but other people as well, because artists' needs are similar in many different venues and cities. So if you can just share this link with one artist, ask them to watch and do the surveys, I would be so grateful. I want to thank Alpha Breton with the Phantom Gallery Chicago Network. I want to thank Liza Simone out in LA with the Phantom Gallery Los Angeles Network and Space in the Gap. Both of those two ladies as well with the pop-up research station cafe. If you look in the chat, if you're done with the survey, you'll see there's a link to the cafe menu. There are brain trusts and think tanks and things going on this cafe every Tuesday. So please come back. Don't just visit once. Artists Design the Future, led by Laura Weathered and myself, will be on, is it the 4th Tuesday? Yes, of this cafe every month, the 4th Tuesday of every month. So come back. If you have your lunch, come for a half hour, come for an hour and join us. I'm gonna pass, any other questions before I pass it back? All right. Thank you all so much for your time, for your heart, for your minds, for your ideas. And Charles, especially thank you to you for letting my mother introduce me to you, and for really enlightening and educating us about, and hopefully inspiring some of your minds through the mind of an architect.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Alpha, Liza, back to you.
Is Alpha with us? Well, thank you everyone for joining the Pop-Up Research Station Cafe. Join us every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 1 p.m. Central. And we'd like to leave. Thank you for mentioning the cafe menu. Thank you for joining us, Charles. It was such a pleasure to have you. Thank you for your presentation from Artists Design the Future. And we'll see you next week. If you have any ideas about what you would like to share in a future meeting, you can always go to that cafe menu, pick a room, name your topic, invite people, and join us for new conversations each week. Happy holidays. And we like to leave the station, and we'll see you next week. Alpha, do you have anything to share? Oh, Alpha, you're muted. Let me unmute you. There we go.
Hi, just a little bit about the, the pop-up research station, the Phantom Galleries Chicago and Phantom Galleries LA came together to create a network of support for artists, curators, and art organizers who are engaged in contemporary public art. The cafe is a spinoff of what we've been doing collectively the past 9 years with Pop-Up Research Station. And the cafe will be a place for professional development. And as everyone laid out, you can come to the town hall meetings and bring your ideas, your concepts, and things that you want to think about. Also, we are all professional and consultants that make up this team, this collaborative team. And if there's anything that you want to kind of brush by or run by any of the consultants, we're here to listen in and provide professional development. Coming in January 2022, we're having Research Explorers once a month come in with some professional development on evaluation and quantitative research. And we also are looking about how to archive all the work that all of us have done collectively over the last 20 years with Pop-Up Research, Northwest Arts Council, and with the Phantom Galleries Los Angeles, how collectively we've done all this work in the field, and how do we publish this work, and how do we archive the work that we're doing. And that's some of the things that we'll be talking about and exploring in 2022. So again, thank you all for listening in with Artists Design the Future and the presentation by Charles Smith.
Thanks again, everyone. Mariana, can you go on Facebook to the network page and put that resource you mentioned? One of the Facebook viewers is asking for it. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.